on this cold winter afternoon. I'm going to try to brave it without my hat. I don't have much thermal insulation, so I might reach for it again.
Yeah, I want to apologize about the heat. We've never had a problem with it coming on before, but today we can't seem to get it going, so keep your jackets on.
We'll stop midway and do a few jumping jacks. Stay warm. Well, I appreciate that you all took time to be here this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic that's kind of fascinated me for a long time and frustrated me for a long time, because when I first got interested in doing family history, I hate to admit it's probably been 25 years ago, I always wanted to know who were the first Volga Germans who came to Oregon, and more specifically Portland. And I had a lot of questions about that. Of when did they come? When did they arrive here? Where did they come from in Russia? Sort of when did they actually arrive in the US? And where did they settle once they got here? And I wanted to try to figure out, kind of, this is maybe the old finance or accounting person in me, but I wanted to figure out exactly who those people were. Because I've heard, the general stories about the migration out to the West Coast, and I'll talk more about that. But I wanted to kind of get it down to who exactly were these people who were the very first Volga Germans to arrive in Portland. So we're going to get to that as the presentation goes on today. I'll just say up front, this is not probably the definitive study or answer to who are those people. I think I've found most of them, maybe all of them, but probably there are folks out here in the audience today who will say, no, I think you missed one, Steve. I know of some other people that you didn't find hiding out there in one of the city directories or somewhere else. Somehow I just didn't spot them. So I'm just going to say up front, this isn't the definitive list probably, and I would welcome talking to any of you who have other information about families who came in those early years. So this is just an overview of what I'm going to cover. I plan to talk about 45, maybe 50 minutes, and then leave maybe 10, 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. I kind of ask if you would just hold your questions till the end, and that way I think kind of all the pieces will fit together a little bit more coherently. But I'm going to go over quickly, because I think many of you know these, kind of the reasons why our people emigrated from Russia, what caused them to leave and come to the United States. I'll talk again kind of briefly about where did they first settle once they got here. I'll cover the two migrations, the two first migrations, one in 1881 and the second one in 1882, who brought the first Volga Germans out to the West Coast. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about, well, what was it like when they got here? What was Portland? What did it look like? What was here in 1880? I was always kind of curious about that. How did that compare to what they had left in Russia? Was it different or similar? And then I'm going to talk very briefly about kind of how I went about finding these folks specifically, what sources I used and how I kind of pieced the puzzle together. And then at the very end, I'm going to go kind of take you up close and personal, and I picked out a handful of people that I did like a little mini biography of, so you can kind of meet some of these folks, learn a little bit more about them, and I even have some pictures of them so you can see them live. So, as you all know, back in the 1760s, about 30,000 people who were living in mostly what's now Germany, but other parts of Western Europe as well, kind of picked up and migrated to Russia because of the manifesto that Catherine the Great had issued kind of encouraging people to come and settle on the Russian frontier, just like the United States later was encouraging people to come and settle out west. Well, the Russians were kind of doing the same thing. They wanted people to come and farm and make the land more productive. So it was kind of a rough start for most people, but they figured out a way to make a go of it. They became pretty successful compared to others around them. And that actually kind of led to some problems. Maybe around the 1850s, 1860s, there started to be kind of an anti-German movement in Russia. So they were concerned because there were all these ethnic Germans who really hadn't assimilated into Russian society. So fairly early on, 1840s, 1850s, 60s, there started to be some government kind of pushback, sort of anti-German sentiment in Russia. That kind of came to a head, 1871. All these promises that Catherine had made about, freedom of religion, your ability to have your own schools, you didn't have to serve in the military, all of your descendants forever never had to serve in the military. All of these things started being kind of peeled away one by one. So all the promises they originally came to Russia for were sort of taken back. Another big factor, I think, that doesn't get talked about as much is just a shortage of land. So there were about 30,000 people that originally came in the 1760s, but by the time you got to the 1860s, the population had increased by about 12 times, maybe a little more than that. So the population's growing. They're working under this system called the Mir system, where all of the farmland was sort of reallocated at every census. And it was allocated based on the number of males in your household. So the amount of land wasn't being increased, at least initially. Later they started forming daughter colonies to provide more land, but even that was outstripped by the population growth. So by the time you get to the 1860s, you're down to about roughly 10 acres of land for every male in your household, which is not a lot. I'm not a farmer, but those of you who know more about farming than I do probably know 10 acres for every male in your household isn't a huge amount to make a living off of. So pressure on population, not enough land, and they start hearing about land being available in America basically for free under the Homestead Act. Another factor I think that's really kind of pertinent to the group that came to Portland was something called the Brethren Movement, which actually there's a church here called the Brethren Church tied into this group. And they were a group of people who, they worshiped somewhat independently from the church. They wanted to have kind of their own sort of personal relationship with God. They weren't outside of the church, but they also kind of worshiped in their own ways. And that made some of the church leaders in Russia nervous. They didn't like that. So the Brethren became kind of a somewhat persecuted group. And the movement itself was actually banned in 1888, which prompted a lot of people to pick up and move somewhere else at that particular point in time. One thing you've heard a lot about probably was the military service requirement that went into place in 1874. So up to that time, Catherine had promised you and all of your descendants forever and ever will never have to serve in the military. Well, in 1874, the Russian government said, well, it's about 100 years since she said that, and that's forever. So deal's off, you have to join the military now. And a lot of people weren't crazy about that idea. This one I'm a little bit I think there are probably people who went both ways on this. I'm sure there are people who did not want to serve in the military. But I've seen so many family photos. I put one on this slide from a fellow here in Portland, Adam Hahn, who gave this to me. And this is of, I think, of his great-grandfather. And he was clearly proud to be in the military. He had somebody paint a picture of him on his horse in the Russian border patrol with his, gun blazing. And it doesn't look to me like he didn't want to be in the military. That's just my kind of feeling about that. And I've seen lots of other photos of Volga Germans wearing military uniforms, and they kind of look like they're proud to be in the military. So I think this probably did prompt some people to go. I'm not denying that, but I think there are probably other people who this didn't scare them away. And then of course they were starting to hear all these reports about opportunities in America, and where did they hear those reports from? Well, these folks are pretty smart, so they selected a bunch of scouts. I think there were 14 of them. Some were Protestant, from the Protestant villages, some from the Catholic villages. They were all sent over to the U.S. in 1874 to kind of have a look around and report back on what they found. So they were in Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa. I think they even took a look around in Arkansas for a while before they went back. And their reports were kind of overwhelmingly favorable about opportunities that they found here. Two of the scouts were from the colony of Norca. I'm looking around in here, and lots of people have Norca connections. And one of them was a fellow by the name of Johannes Krieger. I'm happy I actually have a photo of Johannes and his wife and daughter. So he was one of the guys who came over, looked around, went back to Russia, said, hey, it's all good in the United States, let's get out of here. So he ended up staying in Russia for a few years, and then he came over and I think settled in Nebraska. So, okay, it's 1875, and we're getting ready to go, but there's one more person I want to talk about who had a major impact, I think, on the group that came here to Portland and Oregon in general, is Reverend Starkle from the village of Norca. He was born there in 1839. He went to a seminary in Basel, Switzerland, and after he graduated from seminary, he was assigned to a church in Wisconsin, of all places. So he was over here serving a church in Wisconsin in the 1860s. So now we're 10 years before any Volga Germans have come to the U.S. So he's certainly one of the first, maybe the first Volga German who came to the United States. So he's here, he's learning about the Homestead Act, which was passed in 1862. So right about the time he's here during the Civil War, which is kind of interesting. But he goes back to Russia in 1868. He gets married to the daughter of the current pastor in Norca at the time, Christoph Bonvich. And when Reverend Bonvich was no longer able to serve as pastor, Reverend Starkle took over, and I think was probably the longest serving pastor in the colony of Norca by far. He also happened to be a leader in this Brethren movement I touched on a little bit earlier. So most of the pastors didn't like the Brethren movement. They felt sort of threatened by it. But Reverend Starkle did not. He was on board with it and actually was kind of a leader in this group. So he'd been to the U.S. He knew that people in this Brethren movement were sometimes being persecuted for their views. So he was kind of encouraging people to look at going to the United States. He'd been here, he knew what it was like. So I think he played a very, very important role, especially in people coming here to Oregon and to Portland. So off we go. Sorry, my photo went over the title there a little bit, but so the Scouts came back in 1874. Didn't take long for people to pack up and get going. By June of 1875, this is the first ship with Volga Germans on it that we know of. The city of Brussels arrived in New York with a whole bunch of people, and a lot of them from the colony of Norca. Where did they first settle? That was one of the questions I was trying to figure out. And a lot of people first went to Ohio, which I didn't know. I just assumed everybody went to Nebraska or Kansas, but there was a pretty large group who initially went to Ohio. They settled on railroad land there, and for reasons I haven't been able to completely figure out, that arrangement did not last very long. So they're only in Ohio for maybe a year or two, and then almost all of the Ohio folks went to Nebraska. Others went to Rush County and Ellis County in Kansas, and almost all of them were taking land under the Homestead Act. You could get 160 acres kind of basically for free if you agreed to work the land, build a house on it, and you had to kind of stay there for 5 years. That was the deal. Pretty good deal for 160 acres of land. So they thought. The Kansas group and the Nebraska groups were actually pretty close together. I didn't get this until I started looking at maps, which I love to look at. But if you look at where they were settled in those states, they weren't very far apart. Maybe like from here to Eugene at the furthest. So there's probably some level of communication with these folks. The other interesting thing I found is a lot of the Protestant Volga Germans were sort of influenced by Mennonites and Seventh-day Adventists when they came to the U.S. because they didn't really have a complete replacement church. The Lutheran church wasn't exactly the Lutheran church they had been part of in Russia. It was different. So they were looking for, I think, a place to kind of fit in when they got here. And many of them either became Mennonites or Seventh-day Adventists. And hold on to that thought because it'll follow us all the way to Portland. So here we are on the Great American Plains. Sounds like a wonderful place to be, right? Well, I think they found out maybe it wasn't as great as they thought. It was hard work, obviously, to kind of clear the land, get it plowed, plant the crops, but I think they found that life was pretty hard because in Russia they lived in sort of a close community. You all lived together and you went out to the fields to work. So you kind of had a social connection to people. Well, the Homestead Act made you live on your own land. So you're on 160 acres by yourself. The wind is blowing kind of nonstop. One thing I didn't know is, I guess electrical storms are kind of unusual in Russia. Not so unusual in the Midwest. They had droughts, grasshopper infestations, and the group in Nebraska happened to settle in an area where the Great Texas Cattle Drive went through every year. And I guess the cattle drivers didn't really care about whatever crops you had planted, or, the cows were going through whether your crops were there or not. So they got a little frustrated with that, and they started looking around for other opportunities. So enter this guy. Has a large impact on why Volga Germans ended up in this part of the world. His name was Henry Villard. He's actually a German. He was born in Bavaria. Heinrich Gustav Hilgard, which that was his actual name. Why he changed it to Villard, I haven't quite figured out. It sounds French and sophisticated, I think, but I'm just making that up. Anyway, Villard becomes very successful, becomes the president and owner of a number of large companies, including the Northern Pacific Railroad, the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, also known as the OR and NC. He was also head of something called the Oregon Improvement Commission, sort of tasked with getting people to come out to the Northwest and settle. So he was a promoter, and obviously bringing people to the Northwest was a good thing for him. Because if you got a railroad and you got a bunch of land that came along with building the railroad, the government gave the railroads land to build the railroads. Well, you needed to fill up the land with farmers. Farmers would grow stuff. They need to get the stuff to market, right? How are they going to get it to market? Well, on a train. So it was it's kind of, I guess, win-win situation for everybody. It benefited the settlers, it benefited the railroads. So these Volga Germans who were looking for other opportunities sort of got in touch with the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company. Their letters were usually forwarded to Villard, who could probably actually read them in German. And the railroads were very welcoming and very encouraging about getting them to come out west to settle. So those of you who are University of Oregon Duck fans, you owe this guy your life, because he stepped in 1883 when the University of Oregon was going bankrupt, and he paid off their debt and gave them $50,000 to keep them going. So as an Oregon State fan, I have mixed feelings about Mr. Villard, but I'll get over it. I'll be okay. I guess there's still a building on campus, I'm told, in Eugene. Carolyn's shaking her head. I think it's one of the oldest buildings on campus, and it's named after Mr. Villard. Okay, so it's 1881 now. The Kansas group is talking to the railroad folks. They're hearing encouraging things about going west. They're hearing reports from people who have been out west working on the railroads. They're coming back saying, hey, life's good out there. The railroad makes a deal with them to give them kind of discounted rates on the railroad to get out west. So the first group from Kansas is they're getting packed up and ready to go in the spring of 1881. And I'm sorry this map is probably really hard to see, but you can kind of see where Nebraska and Kansas are up here. The dark line is the Union Pacific Railroad line, which was the only way you could get to the West Coast in those days on a railroad. So the Kansas folks packed up, got themselves over to the Union Pacific line. They'd made arrangements with the railroad to ride the Union Pacific line to, well, you couldn't get to Portland. You can see where the black line goes, nowhere close to Portland. They went to San Francisco. So they got to San Francisco. Our friend Mr. Villard happened to own something called the Oregon Steamship Company. Very handy. He had these boats that went from San Francisco to Portland. So they all got on a boat in San Francisco and arrived here in Portland. And we're going to talk about more about those folks in just a little bit. I don't know what's happened to my images and my titles. They've gotten kind of wonky on Jim's computer. Sorry about that you can't see them. But this is actually a photo of the ship, I believe, that they arrived on. It is the steamship Oregon. There were two ships that went between San Francisco and Portland at that time. This is the main one that was used. So I'm pretty sure they arrived on this one, but I can't prove that fact yet. But the sister ship, I think, was very similar in design. So when they first got to Portland, they were riding on either this ship or something that looked very close to it. Okay, so we've got the Kansas group. It's 1881. Kind of going back a little bit, 1 year earlier, 1880, there was a group in Nebraska who they were thinking about coming out west too. They planned to come in 1880 for reasons I don't really understand. They were going back and forth with the railroad. They communicated directly with Mr. Villard, but it wasn't until 1882 that they actually decided to move. So this group took a different kind of mode of transportation. They loaded up their wagons and their horses And they came out, well, at least they got started on the way out to Oregon by that mode. So again, this map is probably a little hard to see from this distance, but again, you see this sort of black line kind of down at the bottom. That again is the Union Pacific line. So these folks, they actually took all their horses, wagons, animals, they loaded them onto flat cars on the Union Pacific line, and they rode the rail to Ogden, Utah. You can kind of see the Great Salt Lake about right there. And Ogden's kind of up on the northern end of the Great Salt Lake. So they got all the way out to Ogden, and then they unloaded all of their stuff, their wagons, their horses, their gear. And they worked for a little while in Ogden for the railroads to make some money so they could keep kind of traveling westward. So in May of 1882, they depart Ogden, kind of heading northwest. So they're kind of heading towards like Baker City area. So there's no rail line at that point. So they're in their covered wagons. This is, you know, all the stuff you've seen on TV, westerns for years. They're those folks. It's not a 100% Volga German wagon train. There were about 40 wagons. Some families had multiple wagons. And I think only about 28 of them were Volga German families. The other families were kind of English-speaking families. So it's kind of a mixed group that was working its way out west. So they worked their way up to Pendleton, and a big part of the group decides we're going to go to Walla Walla. That's kind of going to be our destination. But there are a handful of folks who decide, nope, we're going to keep going. We're going to go down the Columbia Gorge. We're heading towards Portland. So again, the main group branched off. Some stayed in Walla Walla, but there was this other fellow named Mr. Ritz, who happened to have this new little town that he had founded up in eastern Washington. Some of you may have heard of it or been there. It's called Ritzville. So Mr. Ritz was encouraging all these new immigrants to come and settle on his land. He'd make them a good deal. They found work with him, and that was enticing to quite a few. So if you go up to the Palouse country today, you'll still find lots of Volga Germans living in the Ritzville, Walla Walla area. If you happen to be in Ritzville, there's actually a sculpture there that kind of memorializes this wagon train group, which I think is kind of cool. Anybody know the artist, Lamar Teal? Again, a lot of folks decided to stay up in Washington, but some of them decided to kind of keep heading west down the Columbia Gorge. This is another little mystery for me, because when you get to the Dalles, you kind of have to make a decision about how you're going to go the rest of the way, because the rail line doesn't go all the way to Portland. It's 1882, there's no through rail connection to Portland. So you either have to go at the Dalles, turn south, go around the south side of Mount Hood on the Barlow Trail, and then come into Portland that way. Or they had the railroads, Mr. Villard had this nice system where you could use a combination of sort of steamboats and portage railroads, because at that time there were no dams. So you had rapids, falls that you had to get around. The steamboat couldn't go through those. So they had to portage around these areas. From what I've read, most people kind of chose the Barlow Road because you can kind of stay in your horse and your wagon, and it was a little easier in many ways. But on the other hand, they're kind of coming out west because of the railroads. So I kind of wonder if maybe they use the portage railroads and the steamships to get here. I don't know is the real answer, but if any of you have family stories or know which route they took, I would love to learn that. So, what was Portland like in the 1880s? That was a while ago, right? So, 140 years ago, something like that. So in 1851, Portland was incorporated as a city, a giant population of 821 people at that time. Imagine traffic wasn't quite as bad as it is today. But it was growing fast. You can see on this slide, in 30 years, it had gone from 821 people to over 17,000. So that's pretty good growth. Interesting fact, in 1880, I think it was over 50% of people living here were either born in another country or had at least one parent that was born in another country. So pretty heavy kind of immigrant population. And again, at that time, no, at least early 1800s, no railroads, no direct railroad connection here in Portland. The only way you could get across the Willamette River at that time was on a ferry. The first bridge wasn't built until 1887. And at that time, Portland wasn't a city by itself. There was Portland, which was kind of on the west bank of the Willamette River. There was another city called East Portland, which is kind of over on the east side, sort of OMSI, kind of inner industrial kind of area today. And then this tiny little town called Albina, which was a separate sort of city unto itself. Now all three of them merged in 1891, but in the early 1880s, they were all separate jurisdictions with their own mayor, fire department, newspapers. So this is a map I found on the Library of Congress. It's really great if you want to look at it. You can kind of zoom in down to street level. It has street names on it. It's kind of unbelievable, whoever created this back in the 1870s. But I took a little chunk of it and blew it up. Again, I don't know how well you can see it, but sort of way over here on the other side of the river, it says Albina, and there's a tiny little number of buildings there. If you go down the river on the other side, you can see sort of a little piece of East Portland at that time. And then Portland is kind of this larger community on the west bank of the Willamette River. So as you can see, there wasn't a lot in Portland in the 1880s. Pretty small place, especially on the east side of the river. Very, very small place. These drawings are kind of fun because they're sort of idealized. I think they were used for marketing purposes to get people to come out west. Not to be cynical, but this is a great photograph from the Oregon Historical Society. You can go to their website and blow it up as big as you want. But this was taken in 1882, about the same time as people came here, almost exactly the same time. And if you enlarge it, you can see it wasn't quite as neat and pretty. It's a little bit it's a frontier town. You can tell it's a little rough and tumble. This is the plat that was created in 1873 to create the township of Albina. Pretty small place at the time. Was actually founded by a guy by the name, or purchased by a guy by the name of William Page. And Albina was named after his wife and his daughter, whose name, they actually say, the family says it's pronounced Albina. It's not Albina, but of course it's been sort of changed to its more popular pronunciation today. He sold it to two fellows, Edwin Russell and George Williams. If you've ever been in that part of Portland, most of you have. You know where Russell Street is and Williams Avenue is. Well, those are the guys right there. There were 143 people living there in 1880, so not a very big place, 143 people. And I just threw in some numbers for fun. In Russia, if you were living in Norca at that time, there were probably about 8,000 people in Norca in 1880. If you lived in Frank, about 5,000. Yagovnaya, Polyana, about 5,000 people. So Albina would be pretty small compared to where they came from. The great attraction to Albina was its proximity to the rail yards that were being built at that time and the shipping terminals. So definitely was an appeal to people working in those industries. Oregon Railway and Navigation Company sort of finished their line from further up the gorge all the way into Portland in September of 1883. So now you could take a train all the way from Portland to the East Coast. But before that, you had to find some other way. I dug around and found this great photo on the Library of Congress website, because one of the questions I always had is, well, where did the first people who came here, where did they actually arrive on a train? Once the trains could come, after these first two groups, then trains started coming, but where did they actually get off the train? Because I always thought, well, probably on Union Station, downtown, we've all been there. Well, no, Union Station didn't even exist for quite a while. So the very first train depot in Portland was this one here. This is a stereoscope photograph, so it's kind of doubled. I think you put it into some little device. Remember those, what were those things called that we had when we were
Master
kids?
Viewmaster.
Yeah, they're like the Viewmaster. But this is the first train depot. It was located about where the east end of the steel bridge is today. So when the first people came in kind of 1883 to, I'm trying to remember, Union Station I think was built like in the 1890s. So for quite a while, this is where people got off the train when they came to Portland, which I think was kind of fun. There was a lot of work going on to build this huge rail works in Albina in the 1880s. A lot of where the rail yard is today was just kind of wetland area. So first it had to be filled. So it was filled in with probably dredge material, or sand was brought in to make it level. And it wasn't just for one railroad. This was to serve, I think, 5 different railroads. So they had machine shops, carpentry shops, everything you need to run a railroad was going to be located in this area. If you drive by on I-5 or over the Fremont Bridge, I think you still see that big stack that's sticking up there. Yeah, that still exists, and I think you'll see some portions of some of these older buildings that date back to this period of time. But they were planning to hire about, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 people to work in the rail yard. So that's a lot of folks that they needed to make this thing go. Okay, I'm not going to bore you too much with this, but just a little bit about how did I find these people who were the first to come? Well, I spent a lot of time looking at city directories, Albina City Directory, East Portland, Portland. You have to be really creative because I think they were doing it phonetically. They'd probably knock on your door, say, "Who are you?" and they'd give them some answer. Somebody in English would try to write down their name. So sometimes they're a little bit unusual. Church records are good. Kudos to these two here, Willis and Joanne Krieger, for translating the Volga German church records here in Portland. They were a big help to me to go and look and see people who were born here in kind of the early years. cemetery records, especially like Lone Fir Cemetery, one of the early cemeteries. Good clues there. Did a lot of genealogy and being a probably finance accounting guy, I did a lot of spreadsheets because I could put people together and then I could kind of sort them by what ship they came on, where they were living in Kansas or Nebraska, and then the pieces started to kind of fit together on how these groups were formed. So, okay, I'm going to talk now down to who are these people? Let's talk about them specifically. So these are the 1881 folks that I could find. Most of them were living in a place called the Oriental Hotel, which, has anybody ever been to Produce Row here? Yeah, you can go there and have a beverage. I've been there a few times in my life, but right where Produce Row is, there was this place called the Oriental Hotel. It's not there anymore. But this whole list of people, or almost everybody on this list, was living in the Oriental Hotel in the 1883 city directory. And they all fit kind of perfectly with a list of people that Dr. Richard Scheuermann, Dick Scheuermann, many of you may know him. He wrote a book called Hardship to Homeland, which talks in more detail about how some of these folks made their way out west. And almost all of these folks, except for the Green family, they were either from a colony called Yagodonaya Poliana, which means berry meadow, or daughter colonies of Yagodonaya Poliana. So they probably all sort of knew each other beforehand, except for the Greens, who were from Rosenfeld, which is a daughter colony of Norkin. So on this little picture here, I kind of circled in red. One of those buildings is the Oriental Hotel. I can't tell you exactly which one it is, but that's where it was located. The ones I highlighted in red, if you can kind of see the color difference, those are the families that actually stayed in Oregon. The rest of these families went on to Eastern Washington. Actually, under George Heinrich Green, there's a Philip Green, his son, and he was a scout. They sent him from Portland up to Eastern Washington to have a look around. He liked it up there, came back. So most of this group packed up in 1882, just as the Nebraska group was coming into town. The Kansas group was most of them were going out of town over to the Palouse area. So, yeah, short stay for the Kansas group. I think mostly they couldn't find the kind of farmland here that they were looking for. By the time they got here, a lot of the prime farmland had already been taken. I'm guessing if they were here on a day like, well, maybe earlier today, maybe they found the weather kind of disagreeable or different from what they were used to. But a couple of these families did stay here. The Hergert and the Shireman families, they moved out to kind of the North Plains area, sort of west of Portland. I think some of them are still out there to this day. They were members of the St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Blooming, Oregon, which still exists to this day. They have a newer building, but the church is still there and going strong. So none of the Kansas group actually settled in Almina. Actually, none of the Kansas group settled in Portland at all. They all went somewhere else. They either went west of Portland, or the Green family went kind of down to the Silverton area. So enter the Nebraska group. So these are the folks I've been able to find from that Nebraska group. Johannes and Anna Maria Schnell, Ludwig and Emma Yost. There's a bunch of Schreibers, the Heinrich Schreiber and Elizabeth Schreiber, the mother and father. Some of their sons came with as well. These are like third cousins twice removed to me, so really close in my family line. I didn't actually even know anything about these folks until I started doing this research. Conrad and Sophia Schwartz, we have some descendants of that family here today. Raise your hand. And Ludwig and Anna Elizabeth Spady. So all of these folks were in Nebraska except for the Schwartz family, which was living in Iowa. And I think Sophia Schwartz was a tree bird, and there were a lot of tree birds living with this Nebraska group. So I think there was a connection somewhere there to be worked on. So from pretty small beginnings, the larger group would grow here in Portland. So only four households from the Kansas group stayed here in Oregon. None of them settled in Portland. Only 7 households that I can count from the Nebraska group were here in 1882. And out of those, only 4 of them stayed in Albina. The other 3, the Schreibers, went out to kind of Washington County, Hillsborough area. They eventually moved back into Portland about 10 years later, but they were farming out there for quite a while. So in grand total here at the bottom, I think we've got about 17 people as far as I can count, including adults and children, who were the first kind of settlement here in Albina in 1882. So it was the Schnell, Schwartz, Spady, Yost family. There were about 28 people living out in Washington County in 1882, and about 9 people, the Green family, down in Marion County around the Silverton area. So not a very big group, just kind of a handful of people. So, but that was just kind of the start. If you really look at these families and all the connections, they were also writing letters home. And you can just see in the subsequent years, more and more and more people are coming. Most of them, they're all interrelated, family connections are bringing them. And by 1920, we know from work done by a guy by the name of Richard Salet, there were like 10,000 people with German-Russian ancestry living in Oregon at that time. And I think that's an undercount, because many of you have done genealogy. When you look at the census records, a lot of times it's correct. It'll say, you know, what's your mother tongue? German. Where are you from? Russia. Well, that's how this guy tallied up the 10,000. Well, a lot of times I think they either, I don't think they lied, but maybe they were confused by the question. But a lot of times in the census it will say, what's your mother tongue? German. Where are you from? Germany. And we know they're not from Germany. We know they're Volga German families. So if anything, I think this 10,000 is low. So I've gone much slower than I intended to go, but it's going to take you through a few of the kind of biographies of people just real quick, and I might skip through some of those just to save a little bit of time, but let me take you through some very quickly, because I think it's fun to see who these people are. So, fortunately, I was hoping Barbara Kelly would be here today, because this is her family. This is the Green family. They were part of that Kansas group in 1881. They arrived in the U.S. in 1876. They were staying at that Oriental Hotel. We found them in the city directory, but they didn't stay for long. They were in Portland about a year, and then they moved down to the Silverton area for a while, and then they came back up to Portland about 10 years later. Very entrepreneurial family. The George Heinrich was kind of a general store owner. He had a store down in the Silverton area. It's called Green's Station. But he came up to Portland and opened up a general store on Union Avenue. This is one of his sons, Conrad Green. He was a tailor and shop owner. This is Conrad in front of his store and a photo of his house. So Conrad did pretty good. He probably didn't have a house like that in Rosenfeld, Russia, I'm guessing. Hergerts. This is cousins of yours. So they were part of the Kansas Party who came out in 1881. They were originally from Yagodonaya, Poliana. Arrived in the U.S. in 1876. They joined that St. Peter's Church out in Blooming near Cornelius. So any Hergerts, you are related to this family. So one of the Hergerts' daughters married Heinrich Scheierman. That was the other Kansas family who settled out in Washington County. So there was a connection there between those two. So Schnells, we have a Schnell here. You're related to these folks. So these are some of the first people I can guarantee were here in 1882. They're in the 1883 city directory, which means they had to be here at the end of 1882 to get into the 1883 directory. They came in 1876. They were part of the group that first went to Ohio, then they went to Nebraska. You can kind of see an example of sort of chain migration here. They just started inviting more people from the family to come. You can kind of see them coming every year. You can see the family connections. Anna Maria, wife of Johannes, she's the sister of Elizabeth Dick, who is the wife of George Schreiber. There's a George Schreiber family who came here too. Funny how those connections work. So this is a picture of George and his family sitting on the front porch somewhere over here in northeast Portland. They were born in Norca. They were on that first ship that came to the city of Brussels in 1875. Some interesting things here. There's two daughters here in the back row. They got married to two brothers. Their name was Matt Scheiner, I think, or Matt Scheiner. And they started something called the U.S. Bakery. And the U.S. Bakery was eventually sold to this little company called Franz Bakery, which we all know and love. Franz bread, the good bread. But here's the crew with the U.S. Bakery. You can see the two Schreiber girls. They're wearing their dresses out here in this photo. And if you look at the back of the Franz Bakery truck, even today, it will say in kind of smaller letters on the back, it says, Franz Bread, part of U.S. Bakery. So look for, next time you see one of those beautiful yellow trucks, take a look. Okay, here's the Spady family. Any Spadies here today? Also from Norca. This husband and wife you can see sitting in the front row, they came separately with their families. She was a Georg. They got married in Nebraska, and they're definitely one of the first families here. They're in that 1883 directory. Remember I talked about Seventh-day Adventists earlier on? These folks were part of the Seventh-day Adventist church that was founded here in Albina by a guy by the name of Friedrich Georg. She is the woman here in the front row to the right, in the center. She is the daughter of Friedrich Georg. The father of Friedrich Georg, that woman's grandfather, is Johannes Georg. He was another one of the first guys to come here. Was on that very first ship in 1875. Also a member of of course you had to be a member of your son's church, right? So, and he's buried over at the Lone Fir Cemetery. But this is one of the oldest photos of a Volga German I've found here in Portland. We may have one that's could be even a little bit older. This is the Schwartz family. Raise your hands back to the Schwartz family. So they're also part of the Nebraska group. I'm pretty sure that came out. This one I have a little shadow of a doubt of whether they were 1882 or 1883. I think 1882. They were living in Iowa before they came, but I think again there was a connection with Nebraska group through Sophia Treber. And again, you can kind of see some of the chain migration that takes place over time, where more and more of the relatives start to come out to Portland. And again, nice to have a photo. Thank you, Valerie, for donating that. You can actually see what they looked like. And here's another picture of Conrad and Sophia in their later years. And I bet they didn't have a house that nice in Russia, so I think they did okay here in the USA. I like this guy. I don't think Fred Betts is here today, but this guy's always kind of fascinated me. George Betts, he was from colony of Messer, married a woman from the colony of Norca. He came to Portland about 1883 and very quickly set up a pretty large flower business. I've looked at old city maps and insurance maps. He had like entire city blocks of greenhouses where he grew flowers. So this little operation here is, maybe he started out with a horse and wagon and a cart, but not too long from that time, he had a big operation. He was in the Yamhill Market downtown. He had a pretty large flower shop down there and was extremely successful. I'm going to end with this guy here, William and Anna Maria Lynn. He was from Denhoff. She was born in Norca. He came over by himself. He was a single guy. And appears to have become a very successful contractor in a very short amount of time. So this guy kind of fascinates me. He was one of the founders of the Zion Church here in Portland. And a couple of months ago, I got an email from a woman down in San Diego. She said, "Oh, that's my great-grandfather." I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." I said, "What do you know about him?" She said, "Well, I have some photos and things." And she said, "I've never been to Portland, though. I live in San Diego." So she flew up here, and her brother, who's also from California, came up here. And we met up and did a tour of the Volga German sites, including the Lind family sites here in Portland. Now, if you've ever been out to North Portland, there's a place where the railroad track kind of cuts through North Portland. So it connects the rail bridge on the Columbia River with the rail bridge on the Willamette River. And there's kind of a cut that goes through all the way across the peninsula out there. Well, William Lynn's the guy who did that. He was like an early pioneer in like hydraulic concrete. So concrete that does well with water, which you had to do. Well, Kathleen, who came up, she had these pictures of these guys digging in ditches. She didn't know what they were. I said, "Well, that's your great-grandfather. They're making that cut through North Portland." I found Oregonian articles that said they did it all with hand tools. And if you go out there, I took a photo of it. It doesn't show up really great here, but it's quite an excavation with hand tools. He also built a lot of the sewer lines in Portland. The photos on the right are the dedication of the Montevilla sewer system. He did several other projects in the Northwest, but for a guy who just got off the boat in the early 1800s, he did okay. We went by his house over in Northeast Portland, and we were standing outside, and the owner came out and said, "Can I help you?" And these people I was with, Kathleen and her brother Keith, said, "Well, our great-grandfather used to live here." And she said, "Well, do you want to come in and take a look?" And of course, they were dying to go in and take a look. This is the house. It's on the National Historic Register. It's a beautiful house. We went inside, and on the wall, they had documents from the Lind family that had been framed and hung on the wall. So that gave us all a little chill when we saw those. But I think William Lind did okay by coming to the U.S. and coming all the way out to Portland.
Where is that house?
It's on Northeast 16th, a little south of Fremont. It's a beautiful house. This doesn't do it justice. It's probably, I'm guessing it's like 6,000 or 7,000 square feet. It's a big, big house. If you want to read more biographies, I've got a bunch of them on my Volga Germans in Portland website. Page kind of looks like this. You can go click through. There's little biographies and photos if I can get them. I'm really grateful to people who contribute information and photos, stories. Valerie's a great example of someone who's done that. So it's not all my work. I'm kind of collecting information from other people and just putting it together. So just some acknowledgments here. Again, this didn't all come from me. I'm kind of borrowed from lots of other people, too many to name here. There's a great book called Hardship to Homeland by Dr. Schreiber. I would recommend reading if you're interested in this topic. It's a very, very good book. So I think I've gone a little over my intended time. So at this point, I'm going to stop and say thank you and then take any questions you might have. So Valerie, what do you think? Do you think the Schwartz family came in 1882 or 1883?
I'm gonna say 82. Pretty guess.
Thank you again to Willis and Joanne. Those church records that you guys translated many years ago were really extremely helpful in doing this.
So, Steve, I was kind of struck at the beginning about the pastor you said that came.
Starkville.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
studied in Switzerland and then came to. Was that common? I didn't realize that early that they were moving out of the Volga, or just traveling out of the Volga that much.
I think a little unusual. It was not unusual for them to to leave Russia to go to seminary, because at that time there weren't seminaries in Russia where they could study. So Sturkle was a little unusual because a lot of the pastors came directly from Germany and were kind of sent to the Volga area.
Okay.
He was kind of a native son, so the Sturkles were among the original settlers in Norca. I think one of the pastors there saw promise in this young Wilhelm Sturkle. He was sent to Switzerland for training, and he's the only one that I know of, Jim, who came to the U.S. to serve as a pastor, so that's unusual as well.
Okay.
Jim?
Look at that picture behind you. It shows my grandma. She was 10 years old when that picture was taken.
It's one of my.
She's the
That's your grandmother? It's Margaret. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of my favorite photos. Again, one of the earliest photos I've seen here in Portland, but that one's always been one of my favorites. I think gives you a good idea of how people were living at those early days. So a long ways from a small house like that to William Wynn's place on Northeast 16th.
Where was that house?
This one is on 7th and Phelan. But I think kind of pretty representative of what a house would have looked like at that point in time.
The river pasture that was after one of our, most of the German churches, he pastored. And once we were able to the Herbert family, you described to us.
Yes, Ed was asking about the Hergert pastor at the church here in Portland. So there were two Hergert brothers who pastored the same church. It was the St. Paul's Church on 8th and Failing, which was torn down a couple of years ago, and now there's a really ugly condominium sitting on it. But they are related to the Hergerts that I talked about, who came in 1881. Somewhat distantly related, but they are related. Any other questions? If not, I'll say thank you for your attention and hope you found it of interest.
Thank you.